This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me. There's so much news going on nowadays that it's impossible to keep up with everything, whether it's out of Minnesota, DC, or anywhere around the world. But authoritarianism in this country is on the march in many places, including possibly in your city or state, where extremists haven't just continued their previous interest in censoring schools and public libraries, they have expanded them to include universities, museums, and scientific research institutions. This is extremely un American stuff, and yet sadly, it is being marketed in just the opposite way. Censorship advocates are weaponizing patriotism, concern for children, and political fairness to crack down on the free speech of people they don't like. And back on the show today to discuss how this is happening and why, and also to provide some arguments for free expression, is Jonathan Friedman. He is the managing director for free expression at PEN America, which is a wonderful organization that is working tirelessly to promote free speech and literacy across America. I hope you'll enjoy. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, media, technology, and religion, and how they all intersect to create our culture. And if you like what we're doing, we do have paid subscriptions on both Patreon and Substack. You can go to patreon.com/discoverflux, or you can go to flux.community. And if you are a paid subscriber, thank you very much for your support. And we do have free subscriptions as well. And if you are listening on a podcast app and you haven't subscribed yet, please do fix that and subscribe. I would appreciate that if you would. And if you're watching on YouTube, please click like and subscribe, and you can get notified of all of the new episodes. That would be great if you would do that. Thanks very much. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Jonathan Friedman. Hey, man, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, so a lot has happened since you were on the program in 2022, and not a lot of good things in terms of free speech and free expression. And I think there's been challenges. Both last time it was challenges at the state level primarily, but now we have federal issues as well. What are some of the biggest things ongoing right now that maybe that have been passed in the past several years in your view, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, I think starting in 2021, we saw something new, which were what we called at the time educational gag orders. There were these proposals being passed into law in a few states that sought to constrain how it is that teachers could talk about um, certain issues. And, a lot of the language that was originally in these laws a few years ago was very vague, but was also vague in its implications. So they would say, here's a list of concepts that teachers can't talk about. And, in a lot of states, it was unclear to what extent it would apply, for example, to um, professors at colleges and universities as compared to K to 12 teachers, which was more clear. And from that moment in time, what we've seen is, a lot of activity kind of build on that idea. The idea being that the government should extend new control in one way or another over public education. Some of that has taken new shape in higher education, proposals to not just exert control over what academics might teach college age students, but for example, to kind of undermine the entire operation of colleges and universities. For example, weakening the power of faculty to set curriculum, or setting new rules like we've seen in Texas about certain topics that can't be taught in an college level class at all. And then in K to 12, what we've seen is an ongoing effort to apply these restrictions not just to classrooms but to school libraries, and to also come up with new mechanisms that essentially may not be forms of direct prohibitions telling people what they can't teach, but they function as such. For example, empowering parents to have rights over what their own students might be able to access in a school, but thereby and this is key, thereby censoring that material for everyone. And this is a very, I mean, it reflects a really challenging aspect of public education in this country that doesn't necessarily have easy answers. You know, what is the role of public education vis-a-vis parents and students? But I think when you step back and you see, the whole picture, the effort to control higher education, the effort to, restrict K to 12 education, it's inevitable to come to the conclusion that at a very baseline, we are at an unprecedented moment for what we might think of as the freedom to learn in public schooling, public universities, the freedom to ask questions, the freedom to talk about current events, the freedom to recommend books, the freedom to relate to students about things that are current topics in their lives. All of this is being narrowed, all of it is being undermined, all of it is being chilled, so that now, if a teacher is thinking about going to see a theater play, a performance, they're going to be much more nervous about any possible content that might upset anybody. And what that means is it's all driving toward this kind of lowest common denominator, meaning the thing that everybody can agree on. And if nobody can agree on much, then suddenly you can't teach anything anymore. And so we have to start to recognize that as uncomfortable as freedom can be at times, it is a better alternative than sort of continuing to narrow and restrict what it is that we can talk and think about all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also seeing a lot of restrictions and censorship on museums and government employees, particularly scientists as well, like a list of words that are going to get you flagged if you have them in your grant proposal for scientific research. And extensive censorship of museum exhibits, including one just recently where they ordered the removal of information about the fact that it was George Washington, I think, wasn't it, that he had
In
kept slaves
Philadelphia,
in Philadelphia? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like there are these efforts over many years to improve improve the story of history in this country, improve the narrative of what people can grasp about the past, to make that information more accessible. And what we are seeing is an effort to roll that back, to say that that those narratives ought to be essentially erased, even if they are true. If they don't make us feel good, let's say, whoever that us is, us being people in power. And that's a very that's a very particular idea and approach to history and to the nation and its role in history, right? To say that the purpose is the purpose truth? Is the purpose deeper understanding? Is the purpose to ask questions? Or is the purpose, well, indoctrination, or to have to propagandize, to narrow what it is that people have access to? So yeah, we're seeing this go way beyond schools and universities where I think it began, and it's been happening also in all kinds of institutions, cultural, artistic institutions for years. For years, museums will tell you they've been more and more nervous actually about school visits because of what parents might complain about in a museum. And if you think about like art in a museum, and you have a parent who wants to ban books that have anything to do with nudity, well, they're probably going to find something to complain about in a museum. So this kind of sense of that every cultural or artistic institution should operate on eggshells, that every educator should operate with that mindset, it's really going to be damaging long term.
Really is. And I mean, effectively, this is kind of they're trying to institutionalize the heckler's veto. Can you talk us about that for people who haven't heard that term? Tell us what that is.
Yeah, it's a really useful way of thinking about this. The heckler's veto is the idea that if you have maybe someone who's giving a speech to an audience and one person in the audience heckles, they will interrupt, take down the event, heckle it to such an extent that they veto the experience of everybody else who came and who wanted to participate in it. And we're seeing that kind of veto exercised in a lot of different ways. On the one hand, we've seen that on campuses for many years with speakers, across the political spectrum. This idea that someone's speech or what they've said in the past or what they might say now is so offensive that, we should make the decision for everybody that no one should be able to hear it. We should stop and shut down the event from happening. And, turns out nobody across the political spectrum, has an exclusive right to that tactic because we're seeing it all over the place. But the other thing is that we are seeing government adopt that kind of heckler's veto. Government enabling it, government encouraging it in a lot of places. And so, that's what I was referring to before with the school library. And what we've seen with book bans all over the country is that sometimes you just have one individual who may have challenged 1,000 books or 100 books or whatever it is. And especially when school districts adopt rules that they will remove books from circulation when and if they are challenged, what it means is it's very easy to get a whole lot of books removed just by challenging them. And the more you dig into that phenomenon, you discover that the challenge forms are sometimes half filled out. They're filled out with falsehoods. They're filled out with things that don't make sense. One of my favorite examples was a book which contained the poem by Amanda Gorman, which she read at President Biden's inauguration. And I don't know at what age someone should be able necessarily to read that poem, but the point is, it was in a school library. But the person who challenged it said the book was by Oprah Winfrey. I mean, it's just like, not you're not even really accurately filling out this form in a very sensible, straightforward manner. So the more the phenomenon has been excavated, the more clear it's been that it has been replicated across state lines, and that often you see those kinds of mistakes repeated.
Yeah. And another key component to this, which these people who are challenging books are some of the many people who are doing this, is that these laws in many cases are deliberately vague in a way that is designed to chill speech that is that they get more of an effect than they could legally get, because they know that if they're too detailed, then it would get struck down as an explicit violation of the First Amendment. But if they make it vague, then it will stand a chance.
Yeah, I mean, the in some ways there's been this embrace of the vagueness, and we see that time and again that state legislators, for example, when given the opportunities to make laws more clear, prefer not to. So, one that I'm reading today in Florida is a new bill that would ban the phrase "the West Bank" from all official government materials. I think that's the phrasing, and you have to replace that with other words to refer to the land in the Middle East that is so contested. And it's really astonishing because not only is the rationale for this change sort of unclear, but what are official government materials also becomes really vague. So would that include like something being created for a classroom, a college classroom, a school library, etc.? It's not clear, but also there's a desire not to clarify it when it could be clearer, so that it will have the necessary chilling and censoring effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And teachers are seeing this over and over, as you were saying. Like they're like, well, I don't know if I can say this, and that's the idea: is to get everyone to live in fear of noncompliance. Ultimately, I think that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like uh, it's exactly the same phenomenon that's now afflicting universities and college teaching that I saw years ago with school libraries. I remember a vague rule in Missouri that was a few years ago that led some school librarians to sweep through their districts and pull any book off the shelf that might um, that might run afoul of one of those rules. And I'm actually remembering I have some of these books behind me still from that. I'm just going to grab them for a sec here. Just coincidentally, I know these are on that shelf. Like they pulled this is a graphic adaptation of the Gettysburg Address, and you can flip through this book. I have. You tell me what it was in this book that somebody objected to. I'm not sure. The closest that I've seen is that the law banned nudity, and there's like pictures of slaves here who are, dressed for, African weather rather than whatever it is, the Middle Passage, etc. So, I guess those are people who are not wearing shirts. Okay, if you are told though that as a librarian you might go to jail and get a criminal record if you give a certain kind of material to a student, and that material might be designated as any kind of nudity. And this Gettysburg Address graphic novel, like a book literally written to make this accessible to young people, and you're saying you might go to jail for it, are you going to take that risk? And so, well, apparently not. And so what happens is people are made to feel like the stakes of this are so high that they ought to err on the side of removing materials. And in fact, that phrase, err on the side of caution, as in quotes there, that's actually a phrase that was popularized in Florida as a way to ban books, that school districts should err on the side of caution. And, if we all err on the side of caution when we're talking about intellectual access to books. I mean, do you know how many books are not cautious when you think about like books that you actually want to read? They have exciting things that happen in them, unexpected things, topics that you may not encounter in your life, and that you can only come to understand through the through an impactful story that it makes that kind of information or experience accessible to you. So inevitably, that leads to limiting, the bounds of what people might learn about in a library. And the other book I had here, I pulled off the shelf, was this is a graphic novel adaptation of the Odyssey. There was another one in Missouri too, and there was a whole bunch of others as well. Something like 50 or so art history books, books like the works of Picasso. Again, it gets pretty limitless if you are taking that kind of cautious approach. And so now we're also seeing that in higher education with Texas university professors being told they can't put things on their syllabus. One of them, most in the news recently, was told that he couldn't teach Plato, works by Plato. And you think, oh, how could you be telling
A
a
philosophy
university,
professor,
how
you
could you
say?
tell a
Yeah.
philosophy professor not to
Yeah.
teach Plato? I still, it's a philosophical question I don't have the answer to yet, except to say that's what it's like to live under these laws. That's the fundamental contradictions of them, actually, to what we think of when we think of public education and what it's supposed to do for people: critical thinking, open minds.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is another kind of weaponization of the vagueness is trying to classify everything as pornography and pornographic. And so that's obviously what the Gettysburg Address challenge presumably was. But they also even did it with Anne Frank and illustrated Anne Frank diary.
Yeah,
That
that's another one that's been attacked, and one of the supposedly controversial parts of that book involves Anne imagining herself among a field of Greek nude statues of sort of Greek goddesses, and the artists and the illustrator who talk about that say they were trying to honor actually what Anne was interested in and what she was talking about in that passage from her diary, and the idea that that would be somehow pornographic or driven by an illicit intention, I mean, that's offensive, you know? So unfortunately, that's just what we've seen all over.
yeah. Oh, and there's a huge terrible irony also in that while the censorship advocates are trying to censor these major historical figures and books, they're also at the same time claiming to be, we're the defenders of Western culture from these, evil, uh, you know, uh, woke pornographers or whatever their, fill in the blank insult. But they're literally attacking the foundations of the very things that they claim to believe in.
I mean, ironically, the irony of ironies here, right? And we've seen also many universities now start to set up these civic centers on campuses, but they aren't what they seem. And there are all these norms around how universities are supposed to work. Like, sometimes we can blur the distinction when we talk about public education at large in K to 12 versus in higher education. But certainly we understand that like college level education is supposed to be about, the unfettered exploration of ideas in its
By
truest
adults.
sense.
Yeah.
they're adults. And so, what's been, but there's also traditions surrounding how faculty as experts play a role in setting curriculum, in determining syllabi and the like. And what's happening on a lot of campuses is now this new tactic of mandating through public funding the creation of a civic center for maybe the study of like Western traditional culture, something like that, but then not actually trusting experts in these fields to run these centers, instead mandating, in some cases through law, what students would have to read and how they would have to encounter the topics. And, again, like, it's not to say that this is all necessarily bad or would not achieve some positive outcomes, but fundamentally, the principle of political control in that direct manner of excuse me, of college education, it's fundamentally college education was meant to be insulated from that kind of direct political control, and that's something that university leaders, certainly in the United States, have embraced as part of what has made the American academic system so strong and the envy of the world. Is the academic freedom that has led to discoveries, to provocative teaching, to taking up difficult issues. Now, I'm not saying this already wasn't challenged by other cultural forces for a decade. It was. But now what we're seeing is something different. We're seeing the weaponization of that through direct government censorship, which, unfortunately is just going to make it even harder to ever right the ship when it comes to these issues.
It does, and they really are not considering how they would feel if the opposing political party was in charge of these civic centers, because guess what? Then according to their definition of what's true and what's right, then they would say, well, we're going to tear out all this curriculum that you guys put in, and we're going to put in curriculum that supports our party, and
You know,
they wouldn't like that. Um,
you can imagine the sort of perpetual cycle we might get into where every 4 years we just, swap everything that's taught in public schools, one curriculum for the other. And so, yeah, I don't think the answer is either political party or either partisan ideologues dictating the bounds of what we're able to know. And we've seen, we've seen efforts to do that in of all kinds across the political spectrum. The issue we're seeing right now, in particular, is a kind of weaponization of that government control at a level and sort of scale we've really never seen in the United States before. And people will make comparisons when I talk to them about um, the censorship of schools today and universities and how it compares to book bans in the 1970s and 80s, or McCarthyism, or the Comstock era, which is even earlier, or bans on teaching evolution in the 1920s, which led to the famous Scopes monkey trial. And the reality is that actually the combined efforts today in 2026 that include individual universities, individual school districts, municipal bodies, governing boards, state legislators, and now the federal government, all working more or less in one way or another to exert this kind of political and ideological control over our public educational institutions. That is actually all of those other moments in one way or another combined. It is actually unprecedented, and it is at a scale that this country has never reckoned with. I mean, this is different, and I don't think people appreciate enough, for example, that some of the federal government's directives in the past year, particularly concerning things like patriotic education, quote unquote, or remaking the Smithsonian, or insisting that any public funding for libraries or monuments or other public cultural and arts installations needs to support a patriotic notion of the United States, and it has a set of very particular definition. I don't think people understand that that actually has its closest parallel in laws that have been passed in Russia and in China. That's where that comes from. That's the language. It's almost verbatim. So that's the kind of thing that the United States has actually historically been against. Now, that isn't to say that there couldn't be different priorities when we think about federal investment in the arts and the culture and the history and memorials and things like that. But there has been a kind of understanding that there should be openness to diversity of views rather than rigid restrictions on how people are allowed to think about this and how they're supposed to allowed to represent it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's this extreme naivete also, I think, in that, um, especially in regard to school libraries or public libraries, that they have this idea, well, if we remove these books from the libraries, then the students will not know about these things. And it's like, well, guess what? Teenagers are going to be looking up stuff about sex. Guess what? Teenagers are going to be looking up about gender identity. Teenagers are going to want to read about atheism or whatever whatever topic you can imagine as an adult. Teenagers are going to be interested in it because they're a lot smarter than a lot of adults realize, I think.
Yeah, I think there is this question. I'm often asked, well, doesn't the book banning just, drive people towards it or make it more attractive in a way? And I do think on some level, the bans are not totally effective for a time. When we think about the scale of this, we're not just talking about like one taboo book. We're talking about like whole libraries being utterly censored. So now that's a lot of material that some teenagers may not have any means to access whatsoever. If you are talking about people who still have access to Amazon and other opportunities to access books, sure, they have other means, but that's by no means universal. In fact, the very purpose of the public library is to ensure that there is a kind of universal access to those materials.
Yeah, there is. And that's ultimately who these laws really do end up hurting the most, is people who can't afford to buy a book on Amazon, or kids who don't have access to somebody who they can talk to and trust about their sexuality or whatever. Like that's who is being harmed by these repressions ultimately. And and I would say that, I mean, if they feel their ideas are true, then argue for them, put them, show why they're right, instead of trying to censor the other ideas you don't like. I mean, ultimately, and that works for anybody, I would say.
Yeah, I often say, when people want to shut something down, that it would be much more powerful to speak out against it. It would be much more powerful to debate it, to debunk its ideas, to make a persuasive argument about why those ideas are wrong. You know, Snuffing out an opponent or a different ideology when you use, the power of the state or other sort of mechanisms, you know, in the long run, you're not testing your arguments. You're not going to build up the ability to, I think, make a compelling case. And so, yeah, I think it's always just much more important to encourage people to lean in and engage. And maybe that's uncomfortable. Maybe disagreement is uncomfortable, but we have to remember that censorship is always going to be worse, and it always spreads. One group censoring another, it's going to redound, and it's just sort of a ping pong of censorship. And then what are you left with? Nothing.
Yeah. Well, and we even saw this during the COVID pandemic, where people were calling for, harmful ideas to be removed from the internet. And look, those ideas were bad and they were incorrect, but and they shouldn't have, and the companies shouldn't have promoted them, which is really what they were doing ultimately. But trying to get them blocked and banned, like that's, unless people are committing fraud or committing a some sort of illegal act, the government really can't be involved in things like that. Whereas, of course, if private actors want to do something, say, well, that's not allowed on my platform, that's up to them. But like the government has no place in this regard.
One of the surprising ironies, I would say, of the past year under the Trump administration in particular, touches on that very question of public and private with regard to private universities, where certainly the First Amendment is something that protects speech at public universities, but it's been all these private universities who've been put under tremendous pressure concerning their federal research funding and other sort of threats of Department of Justice investigations and threats of losing that funding, etc. And it's been again time and again the private universities who are being brought to heel in one way or another and targeted. And so, interestingly, they have actually greater freedom to resist, in some sense, government diktats because they're not public institutions. They don't have to be neutral with regard to speech. But nonetheless, we're seeing that they're the ones that the administration has been targeting. Less so with private schools. Only occasionally have I seen proposals for state laws that would seek to restrict teaching in public schools compared to, sorry, excuse me, in private schools um, at the K to 12 level.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, I mean, some of the private universities have definitely stood up for their rights, and Harvard University being one of the biggest ones. And but yeah, Columbia University definitely has not. And the thing that they haven't realized, the ones who have knuckled under, is that giving these concessions against your free speech, that isn't, it just invites more attacks on your freedom. It doesn't protect you in any way.
Well, no, and you're. I mean, it goes around, comes around, karma. We can think about it different ways, but also, today's book bans are going to create and teach a generation that what they should do with ideas they don't like is censor them. They were already getting that idea. That idea was already spreading. Now it's getting worse. Maybe you could even say that elements on the right took that from elements on the left. That ideas can be harmful and therefore speakers can be harmful and therefore books can be harmful, etc. I mean, to a certain extent, sure, you can read a book and it can affect you. But I always hesitate to suggest that these things are so harmful that the answer ought to be, erasure, banning, prohibitions, etc.
Yeah. Well, and it's gotten worse in the sense that so after trying to say, well, the social media companies were mean to us with regard to our misinformation on vaccines or whatever. Now the administration is also trying to say, well, and they had some lawsuits about it, which they lost, thankfully. Trying to say that, well, the social media companies are public utilities, and so therefore they should not be allowed to have any free speech rights there of their own to prohibit content, which is that's ultimately that's another way of doing censorship by saying it's like saying if you have a club that you've set up with your friends, and you have no right to disinvite people if it's open to the public, and that's not right. And it's just a perversion of this. It's like they've created a fake free speech absolutism, I think, and you see that a lot.
You do, and maybe it's not fake, but it's also very inconsistent. So,
Mm.
in the wake of Charlie Kirk, being murdered at a university campus, that's an opportunity for a real conversation about violence and ideological disagreement in this country getting out of control. And to a certain extent, you saw a lot of praise for Kirk from across the political spectrum for his willingness to at least try and debate people. Now, people would say he was never really, I don't know whether he was authentic, whether he was really debating. I'm not even going to get into that. I'm just going to say that in the wake of it, you saw all these politicians who started to try to crack down on things that professors, teachers, and other people in all kinds of professions were saying, in tweets on Facebook. Sometimes I put it, maybe their Facebook settings were private, but somebody screenshotted it. And, there were groups who were collating this information and trying to get basically as many people fired for speaking their minds as possible. Now, in another moment, that would have been the precise kind of thing that many of the politicians who were involved in amplifying this, their party was known and basically making a name for themselves as being the ones who, believe in free speech and don't want to be snowflakes and, want to make sure that, freedom of speech is our most cherished liberty. And yet, here was this effort to punish people for things that they thought and said, as opposed to saying, look, this was a heightened emotional moment in the country, and look, I think it's just hard for us all to remember that actually if people are engaging and leaning in and disagreeing fiercely, that's actually a robust democratic public square. It's hard to get excited about that anymore, I know, But yet, that's actually, it's meant to be raucous. That's how change happens, jostling forces, speaking passionately. Who would want, like, inevitably, the more we um, whittle away those freedoms and kind of soften everyone's speech, we're losing something really important. And I think about those impacts, not just about on like democracy or political argument, but like those impacts on art, on culture, on feeling, on emotion, on storytelling. And I don't want to lose that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I think a lot of people who were watching or listening are, they have to this show, they have a commitment to free speech and standing up for people's ability to write and to say what they think. But I want to, if just kind of go through some of the arguments that they might hear, if they are trying to stand up in for their local library or stand up in a school district. So let's just maybe go through a couple of these arguments. So I guess one of the probably the biggest one that we often hear is, well, you're saying parents don't have any rights about how their children are educated. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. Um, I think that's absolutely a caricature. There is a notion that has been peddled that, like, parents must, I don't know, have full and total control over their children and what they can learn in schools, or anything less, like parents are losing their quote unquote rights. I resist any notion that says that one person has rights that include control of somebody else. Like, there's autonomy of the individual. And it's not to say that parents don't have an important role in like steering the upbringing of their children, being involved in schools, of um, uh, contributing to how a group of young people in a community learn. But this notion around parents' rights, it just takes us down this very difficult road where, like, more and more, I guess the idea is that the students and the young person has like less and less rights and no rights at all. What about the rights of the individual to learn and to explore and to figure out who they want to be in the world? All of those things are also important in any notion of a liberal democracy. And at the same time, we do have to recognize that there is something valuable about what we call like a public education, a shared public education. When people come to a common understanding and have a common foundation of information about something in the world. That's what we think about when we think about like history as something that people may not have learned together, yet they share. And similarly, we can think about it with like regard to different identities. There has to be some baseline understanding of that people of different identities ought to be free to express them and ought to be free to be represented in schools and other venues. And so, I just fear that sometimes this notion of parents' rights is being taken to such an extreme, where there's almost like nothing left of the notion of like the public rights, the civic rights of everyone to learn together, to meet people who are different. And look, like, I don't think things in K-12 or higher education are perfect with regard to like the freedom to learn by any means. But at the same time, there is something valuable in having curriculum set by experts that everybody gets to learn. And I'll say, just I've seen this parents' rights rhetoric also be extended to meaning that a parent should essentially get like a list of every topic that ever might come up in schools, and almost be able to tick off that which they don't want their kid learning. Like, Timmy in seat A doesn't want to learn about slavery, but Billy in seat B doesn't want to learn about the Holocaust. Or in seat C, they don't want to learn about LGBTQ people. And in seat D, well, they don't want to learn anything about, I don't know, communism. Well, how is the teacher possibly supposed to like answer a kid's question that touches on a fifth kid asks a question of a general nature, and the teacher's not allowed to answer it, not allowed to provide a book, direct someone to the dictionary or an encyclopedia? I mean, it just becomes completely unworkable, and so it sows the seeds for the unworkability of public education as a concept when we open the door this wide. And again, for a long time, individual parents have had ways to engage where, let's say, there's like a common read in a classroom of a group of students, and a parent really doesn't want their kid. They meet with the teacher, they come up with an alternative. Maybe it's not the best solution from a freedom to learn perspective, but it protects the freedom and the opportunity for everyone else in the class to learn without that being interrupted. But right now, the solutions that are being put out are essentially censorious ones for everybody. It's like, well, some parents don't like that book, so now that book can't be in the classroom. Some parents didn't like that lesson, so now that lesson can't be in the curriculum. That kind of thing.
Yeah, well, and I mean, yeah, taken to the extreme, this is basically saying some parents have more rights than others is essentially what they're trying to do. That this because it is always a tiny handful of people, and in many cases these are not even parents of students in the district who are challenging materials. um, and they're basically saying, well, if I don't like a book, then if one person out of 100 doesn't like a book, then the 99 can never be exposed to it, and that's a violation of those parents' rights.
Yeah, and apparently, apparently everybody else's parents' rights, so to speak, don't matter anymore. And my colleagues, a group I work with in Florida, the Florida Freedom to Read Project, has been making this point. In that state, we've seen all sorts of books removed from schools, and they have made the case that the removal of the books might, serve some parents' interests, but it's against theirs. Well, how do you resolve that? If you have a community where um, 49% want a book and 51% don't. Does that mean those 49% shouldn't get it? Now let's flip it. Let's say 1% don't and 99% do, or something like that. Well, does that mean the 99% should get it? What about that one? How do you honor that? There's always a balance to these. It's not easy to come up with solutions that are going to appease everyone. But I just want to sort of urge everyone to step back from the intense edge of this and recognize that in the United States today, most of us are going to learn about things. Most young people are going to have moments where they, see a television show or read a book or read a newspaper, and this is a good thing to be sort of curious about the world and have opportunities to pursue that curiosity. And all these efforts to try and control that and cabin it in, not only do I think that in the long term they're going to backfire, but I think they're really damaging for what we might think of as like the study habits, the culture of freedom that we want to instill in young people. That's what's at jeopardy here.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing that with regard to the United States' standing in the world in surveys now. That there was one that I just saw recently that showed that the U.S. had kind of moved from the middle of the pack in terms of reputation from 30 down to the very lowest tier in just 1 year. And this chilling effect, it really does make people who are going to be the future best-selling novelists, best-selling, children's book authors or scientists or, whatever, the future leaders of the world who might have wanted to come here now are not going to want to come here. And ones who were born here, a lot of them might feel like, well, I don't feel welcome here anymore because I'm trans. And so, I'm going to go move to this other country and invent a way to, cure cancer or whatever. That's really what we're talking about when we are cutting off the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, and we see that kind of um, the anti-internationalist trend is also something that's been impacting higher education and is bound to trickle down to K to 12 as well, which is this idea that the country should in fact make it much harder for foreign scholars to come to the United States, for students to study at universities, and there's been all sorts of ways in which the federal administration in the past year has tried to do this, complicating visa processes, undermining research by many international scholars, even things like the destruction of USAID. They used to fund research in this sort of partnership manner where the federal money went to American universities to do projects with partners in other countries doing research into things like agriculture and global health, and all of that has been decimated in the past year. All of the good standing of the United States in the world, and all of, frankly, like the progress on a lot of research projects. a lot of which run on a timeline. So let's say you had like a cancer trial or something like that, or something else that you were planning over multiple years. Well, what happens if you're in year 3 of 5 of expected funding, and all of a sudden the government changes the rules and violates the contracts where they were going to give you more funding? I mean, it's just disrupted a tremendous amount of activity, intellectual activity, teaching, training, research, just that search for knowledge. And so it's had this massive effect. And there is this kind of, America first, let's call it, mentality that, just seems totally, it seems interested in totally disregarding the fact that, like, a lot of American culture thrives on its exchange around the world. When a German symphony comes to the United States, or a play produced in Namibia, and you can see it in New York City, whatever it is, this is what makes the United States enriched, and the diversity of that culture enriches the country, and it's being just significantly decimated this year.
Yeah. I want to circle back to one of the other arguments that we hear also sometimes from censorship proponents, which is in the educational realm, that they say they want that they're trying to have patriotic education, and that having, and so removing authors that criticize historic figures, particularly some of the founders of America or whatever, that they're saying that authors that cite true facts about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or whatever, that they are anti-American, and that they want students to hate America and hate themselves. Like, that's a thing I often hear. What would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of gets back to that question from earlier about how we reckon with truth. And if a truth is uncomfortable, does that mean we shouldn't teach it, or it's important to teach to move forward? I think there is an entire history of this country which has been suppressed for a long time, and efforts like, whether you agree with every aspect of it or not, there have been these efforts to confront that. Things like the efforts in Tulsa related to the race massacre from the 1920s, are an effort to tell that story. And again, it may make people feel differently about the country, but it doesn't have to. You can be just as upset about the censorship of these stories, or just as proud of the reckoning with them and learning about them. It's not a given that stories about the past are going to make you feel a certain kind of way. And I certainly, don't think that that's a reason to, well, lie to kids or hide, the complexities of, um, you know, information that they might encounter. So, I think a lot of that also just seems to tread on, I don't know, assumptions about how people are going to feel when they learn things that are not actually reflective of how young people may actually feel, but how, I don't know, adults feel about it. And again, like, how I feel about history doesn't mean something did or didn't happen. The idea that that would be the metric for how we conduct research, or how we teach people about the world and how it came to be what it is, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it doesn't. And there's no right not to be offended. I mean, like, that's the other kind of terrible ironies of this current moment, is that, as you were saying earlier, that, they had spent decades railing against snowflakes and political correctness, and all these things that they said were bad. And there were, in fact, some overreaches in that regard, and some people that were that their speech was wrongfully terminated. But this idea that you have the right to not be offended at hearing somebody saying their own personal experience, like, you don't have that right. They have the right to say what they want, and if you don't like it, then don't watch it.
I mean, it's always like this notion that if you don't like a book, you should never have been, I don't know, started reading it at all. Like, how do you learn? I mean, puzzle this one for me. How do you learn to how do you learn to dislike something? How do you learn, like, your own taste in a book or a movie or a TV show? It's because you start, engaging with it, and then you don't like it and you turn it off. So, like, that's not a reason to suppress, your opportunity to have encountered a thing that you didn't like. And in fact, many popular things there's someone who doesn't like. For everyone who like loves, I don't know, show popular right now, Heated Rivalry, there's someone who will tell you, yeah, well, it's not really that great a show. I didn't like it. I didn't want to finish it, whatever it is. So, I always say, like, okay, you don't like the books, close the books. You don't like the books, don't take the books out of the library, but don't stop the library from stocking the books for other people who might want to read them. A lot of books aren't so great. That's okay. A lot of books, people differ in their own taste in what they think is excellent, in what they think is a great book, what they, are moved by when they read. We should be embracing that diversity of experience with regard to reading material, certainly.
Yeah, it's like if you don't like Indian food, you're not going to call for it to be banned, the Indian restaurants to be banned. Nobody does that, and this is
Not
food for
yet.
your mind. Not
Yeah,
yet.
not yet. Well, and I think like that's important to recognize too is that similarly in the way that we might embrace like the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of food, the marketplace of books, the point of a library is to serve a diverse community in particular. The point of even a university with its wide range of courses, yes, certainly there's, required courses and the electives and all of that, but on the whole, it has evolved to serve a wide range of professions, a wide range of fields, and, just the way in which that's being constrained and narrowed by political agendas is very concerning.
It is. Well, and now aside from some of the censorship, though, issues that which you guys do a great job at, one of the other things that PEN America also is very good on is trying to teach people about just the general value of literacy and of reading, because I think that that's under its own threat in and of its, independently of people trying to censor it, is that, just this idea that, well, I should, I should only watch little YouTube shorts or Instagram stories or, whatever. And like, that's a serious issue, the decline of literacy. And I've heard a lot of teachers and professors who have been in that business for a long time. And, they say that the students are not reading as much, and they're not able to pay attention as much. And that's really bad thing.
Yeah, you would think that's a thing that people could, agree on and get behind and say, yeah, literacy and the freedom to read is a good thing. And it's known that if students are motivated to be interested in their own reading material, then they're going to be more likely to read it. If you have, this is one of the key things with like graphic novels is understanding that for librarians, why do they have graphic novels in a high school library? It's because a lot of ninth graders are actually still reluctant readers. A lot of them haven't developed the skills to read a long book, and they are interested in reading graphic novels that speak to them. And there's also this idea that comes from like a stereotype about comics, which has been carried over, which is the idea that reading a book, a paragraph of text, page after page, is better than something with pictures. The pictures are juvenile in some way. But I can tell you, reading contemporary graphic novels, a lot of times what you are decoding on a page is actually much more complex. There are ways in which information and storytelling can happen in a graphic novel that can't happen when all you have is sentences on a page. It's a very different experience. I'm not trying to say that one is absolutely better than the other, but they're different. And why should we be trying to ban something that a group of artists and writers have gotten really skilled at? A group of publishers are putting their creative energy out in the world with, and a group of writers and audiences are interested. Sorry, a group of readers and audiences are interested in accessing that. Like, why would we interrupt in that circuit? So sort of some moral standards about how we ought to control the circulation of a thing that through that sort of free market, okay, of creativity and what people are interested in, it's working fine. And so again, you see that kind of effort to clog it up, to intervene, to exert control of a political and ideological nature. And we can see the same thing about education, the freedom to learn, access to graphic novels, what the Smithsonian's got out there on it, in plaques and other things. And in each case, it's an opportunity for us as citizens to recognize, what we're at risk of losing and what we can stand stand against in standing against censorship.
Yeah, and ultimately, standing against government censorship and control, I think that is the ultimate pro-American act. I mean, let's be clear about that.
Certainly, that is one of the things that animated, motivated, the original revolutionaries who were rebelling against that. Absolutely, and and that notion, that spirit, let's call it, of critical thinking, that has been a key part of what people around the world think makes American education. We're talking about public schools or universities, good and unique, and what we're known for. Why would we sacrifice that and try and ruin it?
Exactly. All right. Yeah. So this has been a great conversation, John. So for people that want to keep up with your stuff, and you guys have any recent reports you want to plug or something like that?
Sure. Yeah, this month in January, we released a few weeks ago a new report called America's Censored Campuses 2025. The subtitle is Expanding the Web of Control, and it's a comprehensive report on the 2025 censorship of universities. We look at the growth of state laws and where that's at in terms of controlling academic curriculum and other measures in universities. And we look at the rise of efforts to control universities from the federal government, which have reached, as I said earlier, unprecedented levels. And you can find that at pen.org.
All right. Sounds good. Good to have you back.
Great. Thanks for the conversation. Take care.
All right. So that is the program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you are a paid subscribing member, you have unlimited access to the archives. And I thank you very much for your support. And if you're watching on YouTube, please click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.